Hello and welcome to today's GSA Snapshot webinar. We're joined by the GSA Research team who will share the latest global data on 5G networks, spectrum and devices, a complete snapshot of the status of the 5G market globally. The on-demand recording of this session will be shared with you immediately following the event. And you can also download the presentation at any point by moving your mouse over the slides and clicking on the small download icon at the top of the screen. We'll have plenty of time for questions following the presentation, which should take about 15 minutes. So please do submit questions using the Q&A box as we go along. We'll answer as many as we can during the live event. We can answer some directly through the chat as well. Any we don't get through to today, we'll endeavour to reply directly via email. So please just don't be shy and get your questions in. First, a very quick sort of recap and intro to GSA, to those of you who aren't that familiar. So it's established back in '98 to be the voice of the mobile ecosystem. Work of GSA includes both gathering and sharing data insights and industry advocacy. We've got working groups covering spectrum, private mobile networks, RedCap, fixed wireless access, and membership of these working groups gives you the opportunity to really champion your industry, expand your ecosystem and engage your peers. More information on how to get involved in those working groups is available at the end of this event. We'll share a link with you in the follow-up email. In parallel to the working groups and advocacy, the research, we've got the research team with us today, is an important part of GSA's work. We publish exclusive reports based on the validated and proprietary data drawn from across 7 GAMBoD databases. These unique databases, which Tim will share a bit more insight on later, can be accessed by all employees of every GSA member and associate organization via GSA. So there's no limit on number of seats or number of times you can log in, and contain the most up-to-date global data on 4G and 5G devices, networks, technologies, spectrum and chipsets. And you're going to get a real taster of what that data is during today's webinar. So if your organization is a member of a GSA, you personally have unlimited access to all this data, and you can use it to create slides and charts to support you in your own daily work. But today we're focusing on the global market for 5G. And so I'll hand over first to Ian from the research team to kick things off.
Great. Thank you very much. So today we're going to run through, as Richard says, an overview of the state of play of 5G globally, looking at regional differences, looking at some of the different flavors of 5G, looking at the shift to standalone from the early non-standalone 5G networks that launched back in 2018, 2019, looking forward to 5G Advanced and beyond, and also looking at 5G reduced capability, RedCap, sometimes called NR Lite, and what the adoption is there. We're also going to pick up one of the very topical areas at the moment, particularly with the announcement this week from Amazon buying Globalstar, of what's happening with satellite and its relationship to the mobile ecosystem. Globally, we're seeing at GSA that mobile operators are continuing to invest in 5G connectivity and pushing forward the type of 5G that's being deployed in different countries. And we've seen a lot of advancements happening just in the last year. What I should say as well is that all of the charts and data in this presentation are available in the GAMBoD database. There's more on that at the end of the presentation. So everything is available in format that you can just download and use. So right now, we have 645 operators globally investing in 5G services. So adoption across all regions now. 28% of operators in the Americas, 23% in Asia Pacific. We're seeing enormous traction everywhere in terms of the proportion of networks now that are 5G. We've got 386 5G networks have been commercially launched worldwide. In 2026 so far, and we're only in really the first few months of that period, we've seen 11 new 5G commercial networks launched. So there's still momentum. There's still parts of the world where 5G is launching. You can see on the right the kind of the kilter here. You can see that at the start of the 5G era, virtually all 5G networks launched were using non-standalone technology, which means it was still using the 4G evolved packet core, the EPC, and it means that the initial offering was really focused at adding capacity through access to new spectrum that 5G could access but 4G couldn't, boosting speeds for enhanced mobile broadband, and also enabling viable fixed wireless access services because of that greater capacity and that greater performance. And that was really what was happening back at the start of the 5G era. You can see, though, that standalone is now getting some momentum too. And there's a lot of happening around standalone launches, the red part in that chart on the right. And what's happening is we're seeing operators that started with non-standalone add standalone. Standalone is using the 5G network core, which opens up a lot of capabilities that weren't possible when a network was still using the old 4G EPC. Globally, we have 184 operators in 74 countries investing in 5G standalone. This is publicly. 28.5% of all 5G networks are now 5G standalone. So there's real momentum happening here. What this means for the industry is many of the capabilities that companies started to talk about 10 years ago, back before 5G launched, those are now becoming possible because of standalone. So things like network slicing, 5G slicing, things like improving integration with satellite services is possible as you're moving forward with these newer versions of 5G using the 5G core. There are improvements as well in terms of IoT support, massive machine type communication, and there's also the ability to add capabilities targeting lower power devices with RedCap, and that also requires a standalone network to be live. It's not something that you can do on a non-standalone network. We see traction happening globally. 19% of 5G networks in the Americas are standalone, 33%, that's 1/3 in Asia Pacific, and in Europe, Middle East, Africa, 48% of launched 5G networks are standalone. Most of those are in either the Middle East or in Europe, not so much yet in Africa, although there are standalone networks in Africa too, just not quite as many compared to the other parts of that region. There's also trials happening, 20% of trials, 30% of plan. We've got momentum. There's still roadmap here to move forward with more standalone networks in the immediate future. RedCap is a fascinating technology. What it's about really is lowering the cost of offering 5G services in markets maybe where a high-powered 5G device isn't required, and so a lower capability device using RedCap technology can be deployed. The big advantage of RedCap over, say, a 4G Cat4 service, although the speeds might be similar, is once the device is on RedCap, it can be managed by that 5G network core. So an operator can, for example, put RedCap devices on a network slice, they can segregate the traffic, they can manage it differently, they can offer different quality of service. How that device is cheaper is because the RedCap specification requires less antennas, less performance, and it will only connect to one frequency band at a time, where a regular 5G device is able to connect to multiple frequencies in carrier aggregation. So RedCap is simpler, lower performance, but still has all those advantages of manageability that come with a 5G network. It also helps operators thinking ahead. If operators move their customers off older technology devices onto a 5G era device, that will also help them in the years ahead when they start thinking about switching off legacy generations. So potentially it will help operators avoid some of the problems that they're having today with 2G switch off, where they have IoT devices that are using that 2G band and make it hard to transition away from the technology. In 2026, we've seen Telefónica Deutschland and MasOrange launch services using RedCap. We have 42 operators in 27 countries publicly investing in 5G RedCap at the moment. And again, you can see pretty good regional uptake across almost every region except currently Africa. Standalone is also a stepping stone to the second part of the 5G era. So 5G Advanced, the brand name for 5G services built on 3GPP Release 18. Now, to give you some sense of this, although the industry talks about the G, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G about every 10 years, the industry doesn't wait for a new G to improve the performance and capabilities and the features of cellular technology. Every 2 or 3 years, there's a new release which will get adopted by devices, smartphones, chipsets, and so forth, network equipment, both in the RAN, the radio access network, and the base station, but also in the network core, that add new capabilities. The initial version of 5G used release 15. Release 18 is the version that enables 5G Advanced. RedCap requires release 17. 5G Advanced has many improvements. It improves the slicing capability. It improves the energy performance. It improves integration with satellite services, which we'll talk about in a second or two. It makes that work better. It's also essentially an important stepping stone to 6G. At Mobile World Congress, we saw 40 or 50 vendors commit to 2029 as a target date for 6G. But there's also a big industry focus now to make the 6G deployment very simple, very cost effective, and avoid some of the complexity and confusion of initial 5G versions. 6G will be standalone. It may even be just a software upgrade, but that assumes an operator has a modern 5G architecture built on 5G Advanced. So operators that move to this will be best placed to have a very simple upgrade onward to 6G. So it's an important part of the industry, and it also gives operators a way of resetting any negative perceptions of early 5G by using that 5G Advanced branding and positioning, similar to what we saw in the 4G era, where we saw LTE Advanced Pro used in devices and by operators to position the massive improvements that came with the later versions of the 4G standard, things like carrier aggregation, compared with the early versions of 4G. So 5G Advanced is something that's happening at the moment. We have 36 operators globally publicly saying they're investing in 5G Advanced. We've seen 11 5G Advanced networks commercially launched. There's a lot of activity in China particularly, but not just in China. We've seen now in 2026, Bell in Canada launching a service. We've seen operators in Japan, Kuwait, and Vietnam are trialing 5G Advanced this year. It's something that's happening. And I think what will happen in the next few years is we'll see the gap between an operator adopting 5G Advanced, 5G Standalone, and 5G Advanced narrowing. Because if you go to 5G Standalone, it's a natural thing to move fairly quickly onto 5G Advanced if possible, because you get a lot more capabilities once you're on a 5G Advanced network. Let me hand over now to my colleague Joe to pick up the next few slides.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Ian. And it's great to be here, everyone. It's a really exciting topic. And Ian gave a good analysis of what's been going on in the 5G networks environment, and that's something the GSA is going to watch very closely over the next few years. Let's move on to the second part of the presentation, which is maybe a broader look at various different parts of the ecosystem. And firstly, we look at 5G devices. Now, as of the end of March 2026, GSA had tracked over 4,300 5G devices, and the majority of these were phones, smartphones that are compatible with this technology. And if we break down the 4,400 devices more, we can see that around 3,300 of them are compatible with 5G standalone, meaning that around 25% of the 5G database are only compatible with 5G non-standalone. And that goes back to Ian's point on an earlier slide where standalone didn't take off initially. It was operators moving to non-standalone first and still using the same EPC core. Looking at some of the other devices that make up a lot of the ecosystem, we've got industrial routers at the second largest, with fixed wireless CPEs being the third. If we look back over the last 12 months, however, tells a slightly different story, with the highest sort of growing number of 5G devices being tablets, up 55%, and USB modems up 48%. And that could create a picture showing that maybe consumers want to keen to look at a sort of hybrid working. And we've got to remember, thinking back to when 5G launched, that was when the world was in lockdown and global and national travel was limited. But we're now seeing, as maybe people want to move around a bit more, they need connectivity via on their tablets or USB modems. And also we can see that industrial routers are up 38%. If we now look a bit more detailed into the spectrum support we find on the 5G devices, we can see that it paints a kind of picture of the whole sort of 5G ecosystem regarding spectrum. And that's because the most commonly used spectrum band that the GSA tracks in its database is the N78 spectrum band, known as C-band spectrum. And that's a mid-band spectrum. And the other most commonly found spectrum bands in the GSA database include the N41 band and the N77 band. And these are all widely supported. And the reason for that is because the 5G era has really been defined by mid-band spectrum, because it provides a really good balance between speed, capacity, and coverage. However, that's not the only spectrum used in the 5G era, not at all. One spectrum sort of band that's got a lot of attention, particularly in the last couple of years, is millimeter wave, which is very useful in densely populated areas when you need sort of greater capacity, and there's a lot of users on the network. We've got examples. I think one of the US operators used millimeter wave at a Super Bowl in the last couple of years to allow users to access the internet, even when there's a lot of capacity during the halftime show or anything like that. The difficulty is though that there's only 209 devices so far that are tracked in the GSA database that have millimeter wave compatibility. However, as more millimeter wave spectrum is auctioned off, this could lead to encourage OEMs to create greater device compatibility. However, there is a bit of a chicken and egg scenario where OEMs aren't going to, operators aren't going to buy or pay for millimeter wave spectrum, even though it is relatively cheap compared to a mid-band spectrum, but because there isn't that many compatible devices. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario going on there. The US leads the way in millimeter wave spectrum. There's a lot of interest there. Italy has also launched fixed wireless access using millimeter wave, and Sweden actually deployed it, as I said before. There's interest in sports stadiums. Sweden has also deployed millimeter wave in a few sports, in a few things, a football stadium. And then N28 spectrum is the most widely supported at low band spectrum that the GSA tracks. The most number of devices that use a low band spectrum is the N28 spectrum band. We then kind of change paces completely and look at private mobile networks. We can see that from our latest private mobile networks report, which used data from 4Q25, we found that the GSA, there was 1,953 organizations that are known to be deploying either an LTE or 5G private mobile network. And of these, 571 are exclusively 5G. So that's about 29%, with a further 18.6% using a combination of both LTE and 5G. Now, there is a slow movement away from LTE towards 5G. However, this is still remaining relatively slow, and that could be because of the ecosystem in some of the enterprise businesses that use private mobile networks, typically maybe manufacturing, where you have some legacy IoT devices that may not benefit from the 5G capabilities that and 5G standalone capabilities Ian outlined before. However, there's some real strong capabilities that can be used in a 5G standalone private mobile network. RedCap's already been discussed, but also network slicing, particularly useful for a use case that's needed for mission critical activities. So that could be operating heavy machinery in a factory that required security, low latency, no traffic. That's a use case that could interest a lot of enterprises, and something that could encourage greater uptake of 5G private mobile networks. Now, as Ian mentioned before, a big topic that in the industry right now, and something that GSA is tracking really closely, is satellite or 5G non-terrestrial networks. And there's been a lot of industry announcements recently. So far, there's been 97 operators in 70 countries that have announced they're investing in satellite direct-to-device technology. And that, when we made these slides, if I'm honest, a week or so ago, with the data from the 31st of March 2026, this was not counting for the partnerships that have just been announced or launched. So you see SoftBank launched with Starlink, I think last week, and then this morning I was reading that Liberty Latam, I think in Costa Rica, has also launched. There's so much interest in this topic right now. That MWC Satellite Connect Europe, which is the joint venture between Vodafone and AST Space Mobile, they partnered with Telefonica and Orange, and Starlink partnered with Deutsche Telekom. So there's a lot of interest in this area, but there's also a lot of interest and movement towards the 3GPP standards and the kind of the convergence of the terrestrial and the non-terrestrial standards, and that's because since release 17 of the 3GPP standards, there's been some integration between terrestrial and non-terrestrial standards, starting, as I say, with release 17. And one satellite network operator that currently is following those standards is Skylo, and Skylo has a direct-to-device partnership with Orange and Verizon, and uses NB-IoT service with using geostationary satellites. Geostationary satellites aren't part of the standards, it's just what they use. Most satellite network operators use LEO satellites or low Earth orbit satellites. But other players are looking to use the standards-based approach and looking to purchase the spectrum that's compatible with the standards, and partly, and as Ian mentioned before, the big deal between Amazon and Globalstar, part of the reason for that took place was because of the spectrum assets that Globalstar had. But there's also a lot of trials taking place that are looking at the next stage of the standards, release 18, and the 5G NR NTN services. And recently, back in November 2025, Eutelsat, OneWeb, and a wider range of consortium sort of showcased a trial that looked at 5G NR NTN technology, and we expect more trials like this to take place over the next few months and years, particularly as companies like Satiliot, who's also following the standards-based approach, have just undergone a funding round to explore 5G NR capabilities. So that's it now. It's kind of a real whistle-stop tour of all the different data that the GSA has on 5G, but we've got so much more. I've picked out 4 key messages from today, but you could maybe take away and think about. So for the past 3 years, there's been at least 50 5G networks that have launched per year, and 2026 appears to fit that trend, with 11 networks launched by the end of March. So despite 5G being mid-cycle, we're still seeing investment and launches in the technology. And as Ian said, we might start to see more investment in continents such as Africa, and maybe looking down to sort of South America could see more interest in 5G there. Operators are also moving from investing in 5G standalone to launching, standalone, with 50% of 5G standalone networks that we're tracking that have launched. And though interest in standalone has been slightly muted due to the sort of the CapEx expenditure, but also the difficulty to monetize, we're still seeing operators are launching this technology to try and gain a USP over their operator rivals. And we can see, if you look at the sort of zoom in on the data, you can see that in a number of launches that take place in the same countries, as operators wants to have a USP over its peers, and then the peers want to catch up so their competitor doesn't have a competitive advantage. Phones are also continue to dominate the 5G ecosystem. No surprise there. However, our GAMBoD database does reveal that tablets and USB modems are seeing strong growth, which I say could be because of the changing in working dynamics, and just that people want to sort of be out and about and using tablets that have 5G connectivity, or they need USB modems. And then finally, satellite technology, a lot of interest. Again, we're going to track this a lot for the rest of the year. Particularly, there's an interest in the 5G direct-to-device segment, but there's movement towards the 3GPP standards and the use of mobile satellite service spectrum and MSS spectrum, as well as trials with 5G NR NTN. One more thing from me is on the GAMBoD databases. We've mentioned that term a few times today, but I really do encourage you to check them out. They're interactive. We've got 7 databases on devices, chipsets, and other things. You can see the graphic on your screen, I think, shows the spectrum pricing data. And that's really, really useful, because it's for the 5G ecosystem. We saw some of the big spectrum auctions take place in the 5G era to buy some of that mid-band spectrum. So if you want to know more data on that, I really encourage you to check that out. And if you don't know how to access it, or you're unsure, just send us a message in the private Q&A, or reach out to the GSA and directly, and one of our team will be able to get back to you on that inquiry. That's everything from us. Thank you very much for listening. I'll invite Ian and Isha to the stage to answer some of your questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Joe. Ian, that was an amazing presentation. We've got a few questions coming in now. And one really interesting question is about RedCap and about the reliability and coverage of it. Ian, are you ready to take that question?
Yeah, so I think the question is about, although it's low performance on one frequency, so it connects to one band at once, what is the impact or the effect on reliability and coverage? Well, reliability should be good. It's a 5G based technology. It's a mature technology. And because you can manage the devices better through the 5G core, that means it's possible to assure the service in a way that you can't do so easily with a 4G device on a 4G network. So it's quite a different dynamic. It offers a lot more opportunities for the operator to manage the devices and make sure that the experience is a reliable one. Clearly, if you have 5G slicing, part of the slicing benefits are you can decide to offer a minimum speed or some minimum performance metrics, which again, you can't do outside of the 5G network slice. So the reliability piece should be more robust. On coverage, it will depend on the operator on where they've enabled it. Theoretically, it could be national coverage. Although what we've seen with some of the standalone deployments is that operators sometimes roll out standalone geographically to begin with. They upgrade areas of their network and it doesn't go to national coverage immediately. And of course, because RedCap relies on standalone, it needs that standalone network to be in place. So that's probably the main limitation on the coverage side.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think I'm seeing a number of questions coming now, again, quite a few. I think I'll take the next one on what spectrum bands are being used for direct device. Well, that's a good question, because there's kind of two approaches. The initial approach was to borrow or use some terrestrial operator spectrum. So I think Starlink uses, I think 1.9 gigahertz with T-Mobile in the US, around that frequency. But as I said, there's a movement towards using MSS spectrum or mobile satellite service spectrum, and that spectrum has been internationally reserved for satellite and direct-to-device use. So that the benefits of that is that there's less issues with interference between spectrum bands, as opposed to using terrestrial bands where you have to be a lot more careful and may need to be exclusion zones. The drawback of using MSS spectrum, though, is there's a lack of compatible devices in the market as of today. You look at some of the devices that are compatible, some of the latest Samsungs, that they're compatible with MSS spectrum. But if you're looking at a technology that could provide connectivity to particularly areas in rural Africa or South America where there's no terrestrial networks, that would not be useful as much as maybe using terrestrial spectrum. So it's kind of sort of looking at the two approaches. One has better better sort of improvements for spectrum, of sort of avoiding spectrum interference. The other one has benefits because then it can using terrestrial spectrum, because then more devices are compatible.
Great. So I think we've got a couple of questions on millimeter wave. One is, where is millimeter wave happening? Another one is, as in globally. Another one is, what use cases can be supported by millimeter spectrum? So initially, millimeter wave was predominantly a 5G deployment. Verizon particularly, and AT&T used it because they didn't have access to mid-band spectrum in the US. It's still deployed in the US. There have been some other deployments in other parts of the world. There's a small deployment in Korea, but there were some issues with the licenses twice. There have been some deployments in Japan, Australia, a few other markets. There's also activity happening in Italy. The Italy example is on the fixed wireless access side. What is millimeter wave? Let's go back to that a little bit. It's very high frequency. So it's called frequency range 2, FR2. It's above 15 gigahertz. Typically, it's on the 26 gigahertz band, or around the 40-41 gigahertz bands are typically the bands used. To put that in context, most 5G is running at sub 6 gigahertz. Typically, 3.5 gigahertz has been the main capacity bands for 5G, but it's also deployed on 1.8 gigahertz, on sub 1 gigahertz bands as well. T-Mobile in the US on 600 megahertz, for example. So this is really very high frequency spectrum. And one of the key initial use cases was around fixed wireless access because of that tremendous capacity you get with millimeter wave, a lot more bandwidth, much larger channel sizes are possible. But where we are at the moment is that operators have largely kind of mostly slowed down deployments, but there's a lot of effort looking at, or there's a lot of interest in some other use cases. So one is around the fixed wireless access. There's efforts and people looking at using millimeter wave for backhaul between the cell towers to become like a millimeter wave mesh network. In some markets, regulators have licensed millimeter wave on a regional basis. So the idea being it could be almost like a local or a regional service. There's also potential in industrial automation indoors with millimeter wave. One of the other use cases that is interesting is sensing. So although integrated sensing communication, ISAC, is a key part of the 6G efforts, sensing is also possible with 5G advanced era technologies. And there's a lot of effort, I think, looking at can use millimeter wave for that now. And the big advantage is because it's very high frequency and you've got a lot of bandwidth, you can get more precise sensing of the world around you with millimeter wave than you can on low frequency bands. So I think there have been some deployments in China, for example, in an airport there, of a 5G sensing solution, looking at drone detection and bird detection for public safety. There's other things people look at. People looking at inter-satellite communication, for satellite to base station communication. A lot of stuff happening, and I think it's an area to watch.
Perfect. We've got another question about why operators moved towards non-standalone, so 5G non-standalone, instead of transitioning straight into 5G standalone. And feel free to jump in, Ian or Joe. But
yeah, so when 5G was being worked on, the standards bodies came up with various options, various ways you could deploy 5G. And I think the idea was to make it easier to deploy 5G. But what it really did was added complexity and confusion, frankly. Arguably, though, non-standalone is why 5G deployments happened in 2018 and 2019 and not in 2020, which is the original goal, because it meant an operator could deploy 5G and access the new 5G frequency bands, so improve the capacity and speed of their network without having to do a network core upgrade. So it made it easier, but it also somewhat nerfed the features that were possible. So I think there was a lot of good intention around it, but it created confusion, and I think it meant the initial 5G rollouts weren't really full 5G in many ways. And I think that's why the focus with 6G is to have a much simpler deployment scenario, likely standalone only, not with many options. Keep it simple, keep it easy, make it a simple upgrade for operators.
Yeah, I think I'm seeing a couple of questions here based more on the percentage of devices which are standalone capable and also supporting voice over new radio. If I'm honest, I don't have those answers to mind, but we'll get back to you, or we'll email questions that's more specific on what percentage of devices are compatible with certain technologies. But also, if you have access to GAMBoD, you can also
we'll pull the data from GAMBoD and send it to whoever asked that question.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think there's an interesting question here about on the 5G advanced operators, what features are deployed, and that's a great question. What tends to happen with the new 3GPP release is that not every feature will get deployed and marketed and used by an operator. I've been in China. I've seen some of the networks there. There's a few things that seem to be coming up. One is some of the radio prioritization features are being used in stadiums to offer like a premium service for key subscribers, or perhaps for influencers using doing live streaming. Another thing that appears to be a lot of activity around is positioning technologies. So with the newer 3GPP releases, the network can position a device, even if the device doesn't report up its GPS location. And you can get better accuracy on the positioning with the newer 3GPP releases than you can with the older ones. So that ability to position objects is kind of interesting. I mean, that's the kind of thing you might do in a kind of a more an IoT type environment, I think, more than a consumer environment. Although there are potential consumer use cases for things like tracking a connected car when it gets stolen. But I think some of the positioning pieces are kind of interesting. That was also, I think, one of the reasons we saw some announcements of positioning portfolio product announcements, some of the network suppliers just before Mobile World Congress this year.
Perfect. We only have time for one more question. Either Joe or Ian, feel free to take this one. But what within 5G standalone networks, do they require new devices that are compatible, or can you use old devices as well?
Yeah, I mean, so with 5G networks, yeah, it depends. When excuse me, when standalone initially launched, there were a number of devices that were still only compatible with non-standalone spectrum bands. But then, as compatibility OEMs started adding smart standalone compatibility into their devices, then they all became compatible. I think what one interesting use case or sort of top sort of thing related to this is how some operators are moving from they've launched non-standalone and they've launched standalone, but then some operators, I think might be in Singapore actually, where they've actually then looking potentially at turning off non-standalones. Any devices that have only got compatibility with non-standalone technology, then they'll have to fall back to 4G. So that was an interesting development in that area. But is anything to add, Ian, before we?
I think there's actually a question just came in on voice over a new radio, or voice over, which essentially is the 5G voice capability. So I think almost every 5G device that's currently in use has standalone support. The question is, does it have enough support to support the use cases the operator is looking to do? And voice over NR is one of the key ones, because if you don't support voice over NR, you still need to be able to drop back to 4G to do a voice call. So I think it's more about the quality of the standalone support than whether the device supports standalone is the important one.
Brilliant. Well, that's all from the Q&A. I'll now pass back to Richard to wrap things up.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ian, Joe, and Isha, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Just to repeat, you will receive a link to the on-demand reporting as soon as this live event is finished. That should be in your inbox in the next couple of minutes. Access to data behind all these reports, as Joe illustrated, are available through the GAMBoD databases, and that's available to any employee of a GSA member or associate organization. And if you'd like more information about how your organization can get involved in GSA and in the working groups or access this data, then please do get in touch. You see the landing page on the website there, or just email us at membership@gsacom.com. The latest updates on all GSA research and activities. Again, if you follow us on LinkedIn, if you subscribe to the email newsletter on the website, then you'll get information on all the reports and events direct to your inbox as soon as they are announced. The report that lies behind this webinar today should be published in the coming next couple of weeks. So we will share that link with you directly as soon as it is published. So you'll get a first look at that as soon as the final report is live. So finally, I'll just finish by saying, on behalf of the team, many thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you at another event soon. Many thanks.